It was a cold night in the middle of nowhere. I'd been driving for hours, with nothing but the hum of the truck engine and the occasional flicker of the headlights illuminating the endless stretch of road ahead of me. The clock on the dash read 2:43 a.m. I should have pulled over for the night, but I still had a few more miles to go, and the truck stop ahead was looking like a decent place to take a break. As I rolled up to the stop, I noticed the place was eerily empty. There was a single semi-truck parked near the far end, its lights dimmed, the driver probably asleep inside. The gas station was lit up, but there was no one around. No other drivers milling about, no one filling up, not even the cashier inside. I parked the rig, the wheels crunching over the gravel as I shut the engine off. The silence felt too thick, like it was pressing down on me. I'd been on the road too long, so I figured I'd grab a coffee, stretch my legs, and maybe get a bit of rest before hitting the road again. I walked toward the door of the convenience store. The bell above it jingled as I pushed it open, and the cold air from outside rushed in with me. The fluorescent lights flickered above me as I stepped inside. I was the only one there, except for the cashier behind the counter. He was an older man, maybe in his 60s, with a thick beard and tired eyes that looked like they hadn't seen a good night's sleep in years. I grabbed a coffee, trying to shake off the unease that had been creeping up on me. It was just the isolation, I told myself. I'd been in plenty of quiet, deserted stops before, but there was something about this place that felt different. Something about the way the silence felt too heavy. The old cashier looked up at me as I approached the counter, his eyes narrowing for a moment like he was sizing me up. "You headed down Route 69? He asked, his voice gravelly, like he hadn't used it much. "Yeah, that's the plan," I answered, trying to sound casual. But as I stood there, I noticed something strange. He was watching me, really watching me, like he knew something I didn't. "Don't go down there tonight," he said, his voice lowering to almost a whisper. "Bad things happen on that road after midnight." I laughed, half joking. "Bad things? Huh? You got a ghost story or something?" His eyes didn't blink. "I'm serious. Ain't no joke." I gave him a nod, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "I'll be fine," I said, trying to shake it off. But as I stepped toward the door, I heard him call after me, "Make sure you're not alone out there." I shrugged off the old man's warning. It was probably just one of those stories they tell at truck stops to pass the time. I'd been on this job long enough to hear my fair share of local legends. But as I got back in my truck and fired up the engine, the air felt colder, the shadows longer. I pulled onto Route 69, the one the cashier had warned me about. At first, it seemed like any other stretch of highway. The road was smooth, the headlights cut through the darkness. But the more I drove, the stranger it became. Felt isolated, like the world was falling away from me. The radio was useless, static filling the airwaves, and the GPS kept glitching, showing that I was veering off the main road despite the fact that I was perfectly centered in my lane. I adjusted the steering wheel, but it didn't feel right. Something was off. I noticed the temperature dropping, and the strange sensation of being watched crept up my spine. It wasn't the kind of fear you get from a bad situation. It was more primal, like the road itself was alive, and it didn't want me there. Then, just as I was about to turn off the truck's lights and ignore it all, I saw something in my rearview mirror. A set of headlights appeared behind me. Fast. Too fast. It was a black car, sleek and almost unnatural in the way it glided across the road. I tried to ignore it at first, thinking it was just another late-night driver, but the car kept getting closer and closer, too fast for the road conditions. It was gaining on me despite the fact that I was doing 75. My hands gripped the wheel tighter, and my eyes flicked to the rearview mirror again. The headlights were almost on top of me now, and there was something wrong with the car. It didn't look like a normal vehicle, more like a shadow on wheels, the outline blurry, like the car was being swallowed by the darkness around it. I hit the gas, trying to outrun it, but the car stayed right on my tail, not speeding up, not slowing down, just there. My heart was pounding in my chest now, a heavy thudding sound in my ears. I reached for the CB radio, desperate for someone to help, but the signal was dead. The static buzzed louder than ever, like the air itself was rejecting me. Suddenly, there was a flash of light in the distance, so bright that I had to squint. It wasn't coming from the headlights of the car behind me. No, it was something else. Something wrong. The air grew thick and I couldn't breathe. The headlights from the car behind me flared, and for a split second, I thought I saw something standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes. The truck skidded to a stop, and the dark car shot past me, its tires screeching on the asphalt. It didn't slow down. It didn't even acknowledge I was there. I was shaking. Sweat dripped down my face despite the freezing air outside. But then the real terror set in. I wasn't alone anymore. I could feel it. Something was standing just outside my window. I slowly turned my head, dreading what I'd see. The shadows shifted in the corner of my eye. There was a face pressed against the glass, pale, twisted, and lifeless. Its eyes were wide open, staring directly at me. I froze. The air was thick with something cold, so cold it burned. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The truck was silent except for the pounding in my chest, each beat like a drum in my skull. I kept my eyes locked on the spot where the face had been, hoping against hope that I was just seeing things. Maybe it was exhaustion messing with my mind. Maybe it was the stress of the long drive. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Very wrong. I reached for the door handle, half thinking I should get out and check around the truck. But the moment my fingers brushed the cold metal, the hairs on my neck stood up. The darkness outside seemed to press in even closer, and the air felt heavier, like it was smothering me. I had to get out of there. Whatever I'd seen, whatever was still out there. I couldn't stay. I slammed the truck into gear and took off again, my heart racing, the tires spinning as I gunned it down the road. But no matter how fast I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I looked into the side mirror, nothing, just the empty stretch of highway behind me. But when I glanced forward, there was that flash again, a flicker of headlights coming from somewhere ahead. This time, there was no mistaking it. I was being followed. I pressed harder on the gas, trying to put distance between me and whatever the hell was chasing me. The road stretched endlessly, and I found myself checking the rearview mirror constantly. There was no sign of the car, but that flash of light, like something was toying with me, kept flickering in the distance. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. It was hard to tell when time felt like it was stretching and collapsing all at once. My hands were trembling, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. I had to get off this road. There was no way I was going to make it through the night if I stayed on Route 69. Then, just when I thought I might be able to pull off and call it a night, the truck started to slow down on its own. I wasn't touching the brake pedal, yet the engine was coughing, sputtering. The dashboard flickered. The lights dimmed. I cursed under my breath. I had been keeping the truck in top shape. There was no reason for it to be acting up now. I tried to give it more gas, but the truck just wouldn't respond. It came to a complete stop in the middle of the road. In the distance, the light I'd been seeing flashed again, much closer this time. I grabbed the CB radio, but there was still nothing but static. Then I heard it, a tapping, soft at first, almost like a knock. It came from the back of the truck, faint but unmistakable. I felt my pulse spike. There was no way anyone could have gotten back there without me noticing. There was no other vehicle nearby. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, like someone or something was trying to get inside. I slowly turned around, and there it was again, the silhouette. A figure, tall and thin, standing just at the edge of my rearview mirror. The face was distorted in the way that only shadows can be, twisted and wrong, too big for the body it was attached to. I jumped out of my seat, my heart in my throat. The truck was still dead. The tapping was growing more frantic, and my mind was racing, trying to figure out what the hell was happening. I couldn't stay here. I had to move. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but the signal was still dead. There was nothing, just empty, hollow air. That's when I heard it. A voice, soft but clear, coming from the very air around me. It wasn't a voice I recognized. It wasn't human. "You're not supposed to be here." I froze. The words lingered in the air, twisting around me like a thick fog. "You're not supposed to be here." The voice was calm, almost soothing, yet it carried an undercurrent of malice, a sense that it knew something I didn't want to know. My body was paralyzed, my mind screaming for me to move, to run, but I couldn't. I was locked in place, stuck in this nightmare. The tapping from the back of the truck stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, and for a brief moment, I thought maybe I was imagining it all. Maybe it was the isolation, the exhaustion getting to me, but deep down I knew it wasn't. I knew something was there, something real, something that didn't belong. I slowly turned around in my seat, eyes darting toward the back of the truck, where the door was half open. I hadn't heard it open, but it was ajar now. The cold air that rushed in made my skin crawl, as though it carried something with it. Something dark, something hungry. I had to get out. I had to leave. But the moment I moved my hand to the door handle, the voice spoke again, this time louder, sharper. "You can't leave." I stopped dead in my tracks. My hand froze, hovering just above the door. I didn't know who or what was speaking to me, but I had no doubt it wasn't human. It wasn't even alive in the way we understand it. The temperature in the cab dropped even further, the chill so intense it felt like ice had formed in my lungs. I could see my breath in front of me, misty and white, even though it was only a few degrees above freezing outside. The shadow in my rearview mirror shifted. It was closer now, just a foot from the truck. I could see it clearly, tall, with a dark, featureless face, and long, unnaturally thin limbs. The figure loomed just outside the truck's window, moving in slow, deliberate motions, like it was savoring my fear. I couldn't move. My body wouldn't respond. My mind was a chaotic mess of panic and confusion. All I could do was stare as the figure reached out with its long, spindly fingers and gently pressed them against the glass. The air around me seemed to warp, as though the very world was bending to its will. The voice returned, a low, guttural sound now, like it was coming from somewhere deep within the earth. "You're a guest, but guests don't leave." That's when I realized the truth. This wasn't just a haunted road. This wasn't just a bad stretch of highway. I was trapped in a place that existed between the real world and something far worse. And whatever was out there, whatever that thing was, it wasn't gonna let me go. The truck's lights flickered again, and when I looked up, the shadow had vanished. The temperature slowly began to rise, but the feeling of dread still hung in the air, thick and suffocating. I had to leave. I couldn't stay here any longer. My mind screamed at me to get away, but something deep inside, something primal, warned me that trying to escape would make things worse. But I had no choice. I couldn't stay there, not with whatever it was outside my truck. I started the engine. The truck sputtered at first, but finally roared to life. The wheels screeched as I slammed my foot down on the gas pedal. I wasn't thinking anymore. I was just driving, blindly, desperate to put as much distance between me and that thing as possible. But no matter how fast I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That presence, heavy, suffocating, was still there, lurking just outside the edge of the road, waiting. I didn't dare look back. I kept my eyes glued to the road, my hands gripping the steering wheel like my life depended on it. And at that moment, I felt like it did. The engine roared beneath me as I pushed the truck to its limit, but no matter how fast I drove, the darkness seemed to stretch on endlessly, the road never ending, like it was pulling me deeper into its grasp. I glanced at the dashboard. 4:15 a.m. How long had I been driving? How much time had passed? The clock was ticking, but it felt like hours had slipped away, and yet nothing had changed. The road was just as dark, just as empty. The radio was still static, and the GPS was still glitching, showing that I hadn't moved an inch. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something. A flicker, a shape, a figure standing just off the side of the road. It was too quick for me to make out at first, but I saw it again. A flash of pale skin, dark eyes, and long, twisted limbs. I slammed my foot on the brake, But the truck didn't slow down. The road stretched out in front of me, endless, and the figure was gone. I tried to steady my breathing, to calm myself, but every part of me screamed to stop, to pull over, to check if I was just imagining things. But then I heard it again, the tapping. Not from the back of the truck this time, but from the passenger side. Light, rhythmic, like someone or something was trying to get in. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't want to look, didn't want to know what was out there, but my eyes betrayed me. I turned my head, just enough to catch a glimpse of the glass beside me. The reflection was distorted, warped, like the world around me was folding in on itself. And there, in the reflection, I saw it, something reaching for the window. The long fingers pressed against the glass, slow and deliberate. The skin was pale, stretched tight over bones that didn't belong to any human I knew. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, with no face, just darkness where its eyes should have been. It was smiling, or at least I think it was, its mouth twisted unnaturally wide, stretching in ways that no living thing could. I couldn't move. My body was frozen in terror. I wanted to scream, to yell for help, but no sound came out. My breath fogged up the window as I stared, unable to look away. The thing outside didn't seem to care. It didn't even seem to notice me. The tapping continued, louder now, faster, until it was all I could hear. I couldn't tell if it was coming from the passenger side or if it was all around me, echoing inside my head. It was as if the truck itself was alive, its walls closing in, pressing down on me, suffocating me. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The tapping stopped. The air in the truck felt heavy, thick with an oppressive silence. I didn't dare move, but after what felt like an eternity, I finally found the strength to look again. The road ahead was empty. I didn't know if I was hallucinating, if I was losing my mind, or if something truly otherworldly was after me. I just knew one thing. I wasn't safe. Not anymore. I hit the gas again, not looking back, not daring to. The road stretched on, and no matter how far I went, no matter how fast I drove, it was always the same. The darkness, the emptiness, the feeling that I wasn't alone. And that's when I saw it. In the distance, at the edge of my headlights, a sign. It was old, weathered, and barely visible, but I could make it out. Welcome to Silent Hill. I almost didn't believe my eyes. My heart skipped a beat as I stared at the sign in front of me. Silent Hill? That couldn't be real. I'd heard the stories, everyone had heard them. But Silent Hill was a place from movies, from urban legends. It wasn't real. Couldn't be. Yet there it was, as clear as day, or rather, as clear as night. The sign was rusted and old, its lettering faded, but the words were unmistakable. Welcome to Silent Hill. I slammed my foot on the brake, skidding to a halt right before the sign, my mind racing. I looked around, expecting to see the world around me twist into something horrific, but nothing changed. The road was just as it had been, dark, quiet, and eerily empty. I should have turned around. I should have driven back, ignored the sign, and never looked back. But something pulled me forward. Maybe it was the need for answers. Maybe it was desperation. Whatever it was, I found myself putting the truck in gear and driving past the sign. As soon as I crossed the threshold into the town, the temperature dropped again, this time with a biting cold that I could feel in my bones. The headlights cast long shadows, and the feeling of being watched returned, more intense than ever. I passed rows of abandoned houses, homes that had clearly seen better days, windows boarded up, doors hanging off their hinges. There was no sign of life. Not a single light in the windows, no sign of movement. Just emptiness, stretched out before me like a wasteland. I drove down the desolate street, trying to keep my focus, trying to ignore the panic rising in my chest. But the road kept stretching on, longer than it should have been, winding in impossible ways, like it was leading me deeper into the heart of the town. Then I saw it, a figure in the distance. It was standing on the sidewalk, just outside an old diner. I couldn't make out any details at first, but as I got closer, I saw that it was a man, tall, thin, wearing a faded jacket and a wide-brimmed hat. His back was to me, and he stood perfectly still, like he was waiting for something. I slowed the truck as I approached, instinctively rolling down my window. My voice caught in my throat when I called out to him. "Hey, are you okay?" He didn't move. No response. Just silence. I stopped the truck a few feet away from him. I could hear the engine idling, but there was nothing else. The town felt dead. It was like I was in another world entirely. I got out of the truck, my boots crunching on the gravel. The cold air bit at my skin, but I didn't feel it. Not anymore. My legs felt like lead, but I forced them to move one step at a time toward the figure. As I got closer, I could see the details of his face, or what was left of it. His skin was pale, stretched tight over bones that didn't look quite right. His eyes were dark, sunken, empty pits. The lips were thin, cracked, like they hadn't moved in years. And then, without warning, he turned to face me. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Just a low, guttural sound that felt like it came from deep within the earth. I took a step back, heart hammering in my chest. My hands were shaking, but I couldn't take my eyes off him. That's when I saw it. The other figures, dozens of them, standing in the shadows, hidden just out of sight, watching me with those dark, empty eyes. They were everywhere now. "You shouldn't have come." The voice echoed around me again, but this time, I realized it wasn't just one voice. It was all their voices, speaking in unison, as if the entire town had come alive. I turned and ran back to the truck, my pulse racing. My fingers fumbled with the door handle, my legs unsteady as I leapt into the cab and slammed the door shut behind me. But before I could start the engine, I looked out the window. The town had changed. The streets were full now, full of those figures, all moving toward me with slow, deliberate steps. Their eyes were locked on mine, and there was no escape. I had entered Silent Hill, and there was no leaving. I slammed the truck into gear, but my hands were shaking so badly I almost couldn't find the clutch. The engine roared to life, and I slammed my foot on the gas pedal. But no matter how hard I tried to accelerate, it felt like the truck was sinking into the ground, as though the road itself was pulling me back. The figures, the people, if you could even call them that, were closing in. They moved like they were in slow motion, but they covered the distance between us too fast. They didn't run. They didn't need to. It was like they were waiting for me to try to escape. I hit the gas harder, the tires screeching as I fought to gain some speed, but every time I looked into the rearview mirror, they were right there. The figures, no, they weren't people, they were something else. They were watching me, their hollow eyes staring into mine. Their faces were twisted, contorted into grotesque mockeries of humanity. Some had no eyes at all, just smooth, pale skin. Others were missing mouths, noses, entire features. I didn't dare look back, but I couldn't stop myself from glancing into the side mirror. And that's when I saw it. The figure that had been standing on the sidewalk, he wasn't there anymore. But I could still feel him, feel his presence, like he was right behind me, watching me with those lifeless eyes. I sped down the street, hoping against hope that I could break free from whatever nightmare I had driven into. But the road kept twisting. Every turn seemed to bring me further into the heart of the town, deeper into the web of silence and darkness that had swallowed it whole. I passed the diner again. The same diner, the same street. I'd gone in a circle. I didn't understand. How was that possible? I had just been down this road, yet everything looked the same. The buildings, the empty windows, the streetlights flickering like broken stars in the sky. The road, it wasn't real. Couldn't be. That's when I heard the voice again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the figures. It came from the truck itself, from the very air around me, deep and rumbling. "You can never leave." The words settled deep in my chest, cold and suffocating. My body went numb. The air inside the truck thickened, and it felt like I was breathing underwater, the pressure building until I thought my skull would crack open. The world outside, the town, was closing in. The walls of Silent Hill were pressing in on me, and the truck was no longer my escape. It was just another part of the trap. I tried to steer, but the wheel didn't respond. The brakes wouldn't work. The gas pedal seemed like it was glued to the floor, and the truck was racing forward, faster than I could control. Then, in a blink, I saw it. A shadow moving in front of the headlights, faster than any person should have been able to move. It was a blur, just a black shape. I slammed my hands onto the horn, but no sound came out. The shadow leapt in front of the truck, and I couldn't stop. I braced for impact, but there was none. The truck passed right through it, like the shadow was nothing more than smoke, a fleeting illusion. But the sound that filled my ears wasn't what I expected. It wasn't the crash, the screech of metal or glass. No, it was a scream. A long, drawn-out scream that filled the entire world, echoing in my skull like a living thing. And then, I was back at the sign. The same rusted, faded sign. The one that had welcomed me to Silent Hill. I was stuck. I was caught in an endless loop, and no matter how hard I tried to escape, it was always the same. The same sign. The same people. The same twisted town. I looked at the rearview mirror, and there they were. They were waiting for me. Every single one of them. Their eyes gleaming in the dark. Their mouths stretched wide in grins that were far too big for their faces. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I heard the voice again. "You're not supposed to leave, trucker. You're one of us now." I wanted to scream. I wanted to rip the wheel off the truck and throw it into the night, but I couldn't move. The air inside the truck had turned to something solid, like the very space I occupied had been boxed in, suffocating me with its invisible walls. The voice, that voice, was still in my ears, vibrating through my skull, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. "You're one of us now," it said again, but this time it was different. The voice wasn't just speaking to me. It was inside me, echoing from places I didn't know existed, crawling through the marrow in my bones. I looked at the rearview mirror again. The figures were closer now, impossibly close, their hollow eyes boring into mine. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was terror, primal and raw, gnawing at my insides, urging me to run. But I was frozen, locked in place by the weight of the darkness pressing in from all sides. The truck wasn't moving anymore. It had come to a complete stop, and now the engine wasn't even making a sound. The air inside was so thick, I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I twisted the key in the ignition, but there was nothing. The truck wouldn't start. I slammed the steering wheel, desperate, my pulse racing, but it didn't matter. The town had claimed me. There was no escaping Silent Hill now. I looked out the window, and the world outside had changed. The shadows had become sharper, more defined, like the very fabric of reality had been ripped apart. The buildings, the streets, everything had turned into a distorted, nightmarish version of itself. The once quiet diner now had an eerie glow, its windows cracked, the neon sign flickering wildly. The figures were gathered outside, standing in a circle, watching. They weren't just watching, they were waiting. And I realized, with a sickening jolt, that they were waiting for me to join them. I pulled at the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The truck was locked, sealed, like it was part of the town now. Place of no return. The sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, reached my ears, and I knew they were coming. The figures. They were closing in, their steps synchronized, the weight of their presence growing heavier with each passing second. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned to the window once more, and this time they were there. The tall, twisted figure with the wide, gaping mouth. The faceless ones with eyes too dark to be real. The ones with hollowed skulls. Their faces stretched in expressions of eternal agony. They were just outside watching me through the glass. And I knew, deep down, that if I opened that door, if I stepped out, I would never be the same. But something was worse than that. Something deeper. The road in front of me wasn't real. The truck stop, the sign, the people. I couldn't even remember how long I'd been driving, or where I'd been before I ended up here. The road itself seemed to loop and twist in ways that didn't make sense. I wasn't in control. I hadn't been for a long time. A sharp knock on the window jolted me from my thoughts. I turned my head slowly. There, just inches from my face, was the figure from before. Its mouth twisted wide, a grotesque grin stretching from ear to ear, revealing rows of jagged teeth that seemed to move, like they weren't solid but made of something else. Something not meant to be seen in the light of day. You're one of us now, the figure hissed again. This time its voice distorted, like 1,000 whispers layered on top of one another, scratching at my brain. The door handle rattled, as though it was being tugged from the outside. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, and just when I thought I might lose my mind, the air around me shifted, a feeling like something was about to break. A heavy thud echoed from the truck bed, and I jerked my gaze toward it. The noise grew louder, more urgent. It was the sound of something heavy, something real, pounding on the back door. The figures weren't just around me. They were inside. They had been here all along, and now they were coming for me. Suddenly, the truck door swung open with a deafening creak, and the cold night air rushed in. I tried to scramble back, but my legs felt like lead. I couldn't move fast enough. The figure stepped into the truck cab, its form towering over me, and as it reached for me with those long, twisted hands, I felt the world tilt. Reality began to unravel around me, and the town, Silent Hill, was swallowing me whole. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the faint outline of another figure, standing just outside the truck. A man, his face obscured by the shadows, but I knew who he was. The old man from the gas station. He was smiling now, his eyes gleaming. I told you not to go down that road. Couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. The coldness of Silent Hill had wrapped around me, consuming me entirely, and for a moment, I was suspended between this world and the next. The world around me blurred, twisted, and everything faded to a dull gray. The silence grew, suffocating me, pressing against my skin, filling my ears, until I couldn't tell where the silence ended and where I began. It felt like years, like an eternity in a place where time had no meaning. My body was numb, my mind clouded, but one thing was clear. I was no longer myself. Then, slowly, painfully, I opened my eyes. My vision was blurry, my body aching, as though I had been asleep for far too long. And when I finally focused, I saw it, the sign. The same rusted, faded sign that had welcomed me to Silent Hill in the first place. Welcome to Silent Hill. But now it wasn't just a sign. It was an anchor, a symbol of everything that had happened. Everything I had gone through. It was as if I had been pulled into a loop, a never-ending cycle, and this sign was the starting point. The place where it all began, and where it would all begin again. I stumbled out of the truck, my legs shaking beneath me. The cold air stung my skin, but it was nothing compared to the emptiness inside me. I looked around. The town hadn't changed. It was still the same, empty, decayed, abandoned. The buildings stood like forgotten monuments to something that had long been lost. And that's when I heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching from behind. My heart sank in my chest as I turned to face the figures. They were there again, the twisted, hollow-eyed shapes that had once surrounded me in the truck. But this time they weren't waiting. This time they were moving toward me. You can't leave, one of them whispered, its voice jagged, like it was made of broken glass. The other figures echoed the words, their mouths moving in sync. You are one of us now. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. I was trapped just like the others. My soul had been claimed, bound to the road to Silent Hill forever. The figure with the gaping mouth, the one that had haunted me from the very beginning, stepped forward. It tilted its head, its hollow eyes staring directly into mine. You're one of us now, it repeated, its grin stretching impossibly wide, the teeth jagged and unnatural. And then, just like that, it all clicked. I wasn't just a passenger in this town. I was part of it now, part of the cycle, the endless cycle of torment that kept bringing me back, over and over. No matter how hard I tried, no matter how far I ran, I would always come back here, to Silent Hill. The figure stepped closer, its hand outstretched, and I felt its icy fingers brush against my cheek. It was too much. I couldn't fight it anymore, couldn't run. Silent Hill had claimed me, and now there was no escape. In the distance, I saw the road again. The same road that had once promised escape, but now, it was just another part of the trap. The endless loop. I realized then that there was no getting out, no rescue, no escape, and the worst part was, I knew it would happen again. The road would call, the truck would start, the figures would return. Silent Hill would never let me go. I turned away from the figure, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I began to walk. But there was nowhere to go, no place to hide. I had entered Silent Hill, and now, I was just another part of its twisted, eternal cycle. And just like that, the darkness closed in, swallowing me whole. I walked, but it didn't feel like walking. More like drifting. Like the ground beneath me had turned to quicksand and I was being pulled deeper with every step. Silent Hill wasn't just a place. It was a prison and I was its latest inmate. I could still hear them, the figures, the ones with hollow eyes and twisted faces, moving in the shadows, always watching. The whole town was alive in its own way, feeding on fear, twisting reality until it became a never-ending nightmare. Every step I took echoed in the hollow silence. Each footfall felt heavier, like the weight of the town itself was pressing down on me, dragging me further into the heart of the darkness. The buildings that had once seemed abandoned now loomed like towering specters, their windows like eyes, all staring at me with an unblinking gaze. And then I saw it again, the diner. The same place I had passed earlier, the same place I had seen the faceless figure standing. Only this time it wasn't empty. Inside I could see them all. The figures, dozens of them, sitting at the tables, their faces obscured by shadows, their hands wrapped around mugs that I knew would never warm. They were waiting, just like they had always been, trapped in this hellish cycle. I could feel their eyes on me, even though their faces remained hidden. I walked toward the diner, my legs moving without my consent. It was as though the town itself was pushing me, urging me to enter. There was nowhere else to go. The door creaked open as I stepped inside. The figures didn't look up. They didn't need to. They knew I was there. I sat down at an empty table, the weight of their gaze never leaving me. A waitress, pale, her eyes empty, her mouth stretched in an unnatural smile, walked over. She placed a mug in front of me, its contents steaming. But it wasn't coffee. It was something darker, something that smelled of decay and despair. "You've joined us," she whispered. Her voice was flat, devoid of life, like a recording playing over and over. I didn't answer, couldn't. My mouth was dry, and my mind was spiraling, torn between the reality I had once known and the nightmare I had become part of. I could feel the weight of Silent Hill crushing me, seeping into my very soul. One of the figures stood up and walked toward me. Its face was more twisted now, the features even more distorted. But I recognized it. It was the old man from the gas station. His eyes were still locked on mine as he leaned down, his voice now a soft whisper in my ear. "You were warned." And then, something inside me snapped. The reality of it all, the endless torment, the cycle, the people, it was all too much. I stood up, and for the first time, I felt the weight of the trucker's life I had left behind. The long stretches of road, the endless solitude, the warnings that were ignored. I had become part of the town, part of its twisted puzzle. There was no escape, but even in the deepest darkness, a flicker of rage burned within me, a defiant spark that whispered, "I will not be forgotten. I will not be lost." The waitress smiled wider as I stood, her eyes cold and lifeless. The figures around me didn't move, but I felt their presence grow, a suffocating pressure. I stepped toward the door, my hands trembling but my mind clear. This was it. This was my final act. I wasn't going to disappear into the cycle without leaving something behind. With every ounce of will I had left, I broke free from the pull of the town, pushing open the door. And as I stepped outside, into the cold night air, the world around me shattered. The diner, the figures, the road, they all disappeared, replaced by a black void. The silence was deafening, and the town was gone. I was alone, but not in the way I had once known, because now I was part of it. Silent Hill had claimed me, just as it had claimed everyone before me. I had been swallowed by the darkness, and now I was a permanent part of its endless cycle. The last thing I heard before I lost consciousness was the faint, hollow voice of the old man. Welcome to Silent Hill. Forever.